So we're picking up in our chapter 26 video with blacks during the New Deal. So we talked about the shift that took place in the election of 1932 of the blacks to the Democratic Party. But in 1936, just 4 years later, the shift from black voters from the Republican to the Democratic Party was overwhelming. So even more switched in 1936. However, Roosevelt really remained unwilling to alienate the Southern members of Congress, and he pretty much deferred to them on racial matters. So as a result of that, the New Deal often treated blacks like they were second-class citizens. In 1939, for example, black unemployment was twice that of whites, and the wages paid to whites were double those received by blacks. The TVA was one program in particular that was rigidly segregated. Almost no blacks got jobs in the TVA offices. Despite the situation, though, there was an informal black cabinet that included Mary McLeod Bethune, I'm not sure, and Charles Foreman, and they lobbied for better opportunities for blacks. They lobbied the federal government for better opportunities. And then because of that, they were able to start some educational and occupational training programs for the disadvantaged black youth. In the labor movement, the new CIO recruited black members, and they even had the first black labor unions, particularly in the steel, automobile, and mining industries. So while African Americans did suffer during the Depression, the New Deal did bring some relief and some measure of hope for them. So for the Indians, in 1924, the Indians had been granted citizenship, but it was pretty generally agreed upon that they would be treated as wards of the state. Assimilation had failed. They didn't indoctrinate Indians with white ways, and for the most part, Indian languages and religions still thrived. The New Deal did build on earlier policies toward Native Americans, but as a guy named John Collier was appointed the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1933, there was somewhat of a different approach taken by the government. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 did allow some autonomy because it attempted to reestablish tribal governments and tribal ownership of Indian lands. The catch, though, was that Native Americans were encouraged to give their private land to tribal control. And there was a lot of Indians, especially those who owned profitable land, that were not willing to yield their privately held land to a tribal corporation. And some of them in Oklahoma had very profitable oil and mineral rights and didn't want to give that over to a tribal organization. So the role of Roosevelt. So how much credit should Roosevelt get for the New Deal? For the most part, Roosevelt left some broad principles and a lot of details to his subordinates. His knowledge of economics was not deep, I guess. His knowledge was rather shallow of the economy, and so his understanding of social problems as a result of that was pretty superficial. Nevertheless, his personality marked every aspect of the New Deal. For one, his ability to build and manipulate coalitions made the whole New Deal program possible. And the second thing is that he put a face to the government. He personified the government. And for the first time, many citizens felt like the president actually cared about the condition of ordinary Americans. So the triumph of isolation. So even though Roosevelt was an internationalist at heart, he placed economic recovery of his own nation ahead of global recovery. And he announced at a World Economic Conference that the United States was going to go off the gold standard permanently. And this angered European nations because it devalued the dollar, which made American goods easier to sell, but it hurt other nations' imports. So European nations weren't too happy with him about that one, but he was putting the good of his country ahead of global recovery. And isolationist sentiment in America really intensified in the 1930s. Public opinion showed that 94% of the people wanted to keep the U.S. out of foreign wars. That's a staggering majority. So Congress passed a series of neutrality acts, which greatly restricted the options available to the federal government, really just to stem the chances of getting involved in another war. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and FDR invoked the new neutrality law. And then in 1936, he invoked it again when civil war broke out in Spain. War again in Asia and Europe. So the aggression of Japan, Italy, and Germany convinced Roosevelt that he needed to resist aggression. In 1937, Japan resumed their conquest of China, and FDR actually took advantage of the fact that they hadn't officially declared war on each other. So he allowed shipments to both sides, which brought more money into our economy. Roosevelt did move very cautiously, though, because there were still a lot of people who were very isolationist at this point, and so he tended to be less than candid in his public statements. So in March 1938, Hitler annexes Austria, and the Jews fled, seeking refuge, because by this point, synagogues were being burned, Jewish children were being expelled from school, and FDR didn't change immigration laws to allow more Jews into the country. In September of 1938, Hitler demanded that Czechoslovakia cede the Sudetenland to Germany. And then in August of 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Non-Aggression Pact, and the plan was to conquer and divide Poland. And Great Britain warned the Soviet Union that Germany would eventually turn their back on the Soviets, which is exactly what happened just a short time after that. So the invasion of Poland and the subsequent declarations of war by Great Britain and France moved Congress to adopt a cash and carry system. Again, an opportunity to make money. War is usually an opportunity to make money. But the cash and carry system allowed the sale of materials to the belligerents as long as they transported the items themselves and they paid immediately in cash. So basically, they were assuming all risk in transportation. In the fall of 1939, Roosevelt sold arms to Britain and France, even though he lacked the legal authority to do so. And he also approved a secret program to build an atomic bomb. And then when Great Britain ran out of money in 1940, Roosevelt swapped destroyers for British naval bases. And by this point, though, France had been occupied by Germany, and the lines were hardening. And we were clearly at this point on the side of France and Great Britain. In September of 1940, Congress established the nation's first peacetime draft. And so 1.2 million people were drafted for 1 year of service, and 800,000 reservists were called to active duty. So FDR's third term, he was the first, of course, to win a third term and the first to run for an unprecedented third term in the election of 1940. And so Roosevelt really thought that he could control the isolationists, and this undoubtedly played a role in his decision to seek re-election. And there was a guy named Wendell Willkie who ran against him, who headed the Republican ticket. And since he supported the basic structure of the New Deal, Willkie focused on opposing Roosevelt's foreign policies. And while rejecting isolationism, Willkie accused Roosevelt of planning on putting the United States in the war. And Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But at any rate, Roosevelt won the election 27 million to 22 million of the popular vote. So he was the first to have a third term as president. So the undeclared war. Roosevelt's victory encouraged him to take it a step further with foreign policy. So he expanded aid to Great Britain, and he really did so in the name of self-defense, saying, hey, we're protecting ourselves and keeping ourselves out of the war by helping Great Britain. And Great Britain informed FDR that the cash and carry system wouldn't work anymore because they didn't have any cash. So he lent freely to Great Britain. And furthermore, he conducted these fireside chats about the evils of Germany and what a German victory might mean for America. And he told the people, again, that helping Great Britain was essentially self-defense. And so in March of 1941, Congress approved the Lend-Lease Act. And the American Navy began to patrol the North Atlantic and also to pass intelligence data to the British Navy. And then in April of 1941, the U.S. occupied Greenland, and then in July it occupied Iceland, moving closer and closer to Europe. And then Americans urged Ireland to assist Great Britain, again, because of this threat of German occupation. And then after the Greer incident, which the Greer was innocently carrying mail and was shot down by a U-boat, the United States, at that point, for all practical purposes, had gone to war, though not officially. So we'll bring chapter 26 to an end here, and then we'll pick up with World War II in chapter 27.